So, Caliban's rework is finally here, and I've been a big fan of this Warframe for a minute now. If you're not new to this channel, you may be already familiar with the Caliban video we did a few months back, and I'm so glad he finally got some love, and Pablo popped off with this one. In short, what this rework has achieved, it has made Caliban not only way better at what he was already extremely good at, but also given him some new tools in his kit to make him more versatile across majority of the game. He 100% now owns the summoner role. Absolutely love when Warframes use NPCs and do a bunch of damage with them, and this rework has made this playstyle very feasible within his kit. Due to that previous video, we can cover not only the old version of Caliban's kit, but also the new one in comparison, as well as using some reference footage, so that way you can see via the gameplay and my descriptions as to just how much stronger he is as a Warframe now. But of course, this is still relatively new, so we've got to cover the kit first. And after we're done comparing the old versus the new version of his kit, we'll give you guys some builds and playstyles for you to try. So let's start with his passive, which is the only part that didn't change. Caliban has always had a very underappreciated passive. It's basically a 50% maximum damage reduction version of adaptation. Adaptation normally goes up to 90%. It's a great mod, but I'd recommend not using it on Caliban whatsoever. This 50% damage reduction does stack with the natural DR that come from your shields, so even with this you're going to be above average in terms of the tankiness, and there's so much better things to include in your build, which we'll see later. Onto the first ability. This thing used to be so bad that I never once used it. It was always subsumed off. It used to be a toggle Beyblade attack, and you could charge it up to deal more DPS by holding down your trigger, but it would drain more energy, and the damage was quite frankly horrible. Instead of being a toggle, it is now a single cast. It will send you spinning directly forward in a dash. It has much larger range and damage now, and any enemy it hits will not only refund you health and shield, but also give you energy. And this energy refund is amazing because it refunds 25% of the energy that you just spent, and there's no enemy cap on how many you can hit at once, so if you hit more than 4 enemies, you're going to get more energy back than you spent on the ability. And the final feature of this skill is that it applies his new status effect, Tau damage. This isn't the only ability that applies this, but in terms of what this status does, it basically makes all of your other status types have higher status chance on hit, thus increasing your damage overall due to the higher status of your attacks. Moving on to his second ability, not much has changed here, but that's a good thing because this was already very strong. Whilst it used to be a bit of an erratic ragdoll with the insane debuff, it was still very strong, but it's mainly got quality of life checks. It no longer ragdolls enemies and instead holds them up in place much like Roven's Bastille, and you can cast it much faster, and in my opinion the best change to this skill was removing the enemy cap, meaning you can hit every enemy that is in front of you on your screen within range of the ability, no matter how many enemies there are. This is great CC, but in my opinion, the star of the show here is the damage debuff. I can't wait to start using this on helmet setups now, considering that I got free Caliban with this update, which by the way you should be logging on and getting right now. This skill turns enemies into paper mache. Caliban's third has received a large amount of changes. In the past, this was mainly your tool for shield regen, and that's all it really was. Sure, it could have pulled a bit of aggro, but it wasn't really doing any damage, and you had to spam cast it 3 times to get the maximum shield regen. I like this skill, but I definitely saw it as a bit of a missed opportunity, which Pablo has now made use of. You can now cycle between 3 different types of sentients: Conquilist, the Ortholist, and the Summerlist. The first type, the Conquilist, is melee focused. They'll get within close range and do spin and just regular melee attacks, and in addition to this they will also cast a 0.5 damage multiplier version of your 4th ability whenever you cast it. The best way to describe these from my personal experience of testing so far, they do overall very solid consistent damage. The idea of this being consistent will make sense when we get onto the next Conquilist because I have a very specific criticism about them. The spin attack is decent, and of course there's ways to increase its damage, especially via helmet. And the bonus damage of, casting your 4th ability directly again is also nice. Overall, very solid. The second available sentient is the Ortholist, and these ones are basically the complete opposite as they focus on range attacks rather than melee. So they'll do this attack where they turn into a turret and shoot from afar, which is arguably the best thing they have to offer. Another thing about the Ortholists is that they spread the Tau status with their attacks in a large radius. This is effectively priming larger hordes of enemies with this status, making your status chance better across more attacks. It's a really nice feature, but I kinda wish it was spread more across all 3 sentients. And whilst this may be the one that I use the most, I have a big problem, and that's that this attack is so inconsistent to even go off. A lot of times your sentients will sit around and do absolutely nothing, just long periods of silence and no gunfire, which is a shame because the combination of this and the helmet such as Viral does so much damage, way more so than the Conquilist. So if you want to use the highest damage sentient, I recommend using these. However, just note their damage is inconsistent due to their output. And finally we have the summer list, which is a more support oriented setup. One sentient will spawn in and open up like a portal, and then 6 more smaller sentients will roll out. Obviously this means you get more aggro pull, but the biggest benefit from this is that you gain even more shield regen. All 3 versions of your sentients give you shield regen per sentient that is alive. So the Conquilist and the Ortholist both give the same amount of shield regen due to being 3 at once. The Summer List, however, is 7 total sentients, meaning you get a much higher shield regen value for you and your team. This is the one you go for if you're maybe going a bit high level and you're struggling with surviving. This makes you way more tanky. And finally, his new version of his 4th skill. Fusion Strike was always one of his best. Just a lingering armor strip AoE, good duration and range, and it combined really nicely with the debuff from his 2. And the same thing can still be said, except now this armor strip is way better in how it's applied. Any enemy that is hit by the beam upon the initial cast will be stripped as opposed to just being on the explosion. Damage is more, the casting speed is faster, and your Conquilist, as I said earlier, will also cast this when you do, meaning you'll deal more damage across the board. So when comparing the old to the new kit, what are we left with? All of the things that old Caliban did well, that being shield regen and enemy debuffing. His playstyle was around being a caster frame, focused on those 2 elements. And whilst I thought it was very fun and more than effective, this rework has made him better at all of those things. He still has a high cast rate as a Warframe, his debuff is more effective to be applied due to the CC, he has better energy sustain with his 1, and he even has more shield regen due to the Summer List being available as well. But the big bonus element to his kit now is that he has sentients that deal a large amount of damage. The Conquilist and the Ortholist are actually very fun to use. I wouldn't recommend relying on these to do a bunch of damage and clear everything due to the inconsistency of the attacks, especially with the Ortholist. In that case you think, oh, I'd definitely go with the Conquilist, but they lack that range and overall don't deal quite as much damage. I don't know, I guess both of them are quite inconsistent. I think this is mainly just a playstyle choice between these 2, and then the Summer List is just great for later on in the game where maybe you're taking too much damage. This skill is really making Caliban feel more into his own role now. He's not just a strong support frame with good debuffing, he now fits that summoner role. Being able to have up to 7 sentients around you at once, it's just an amazing feeling. And we're going to get into some builds that not only include his new base kit because it's overall borderline flawless right now, but also cover a setup that's a bit more focused on making your sentients deal more damage. And of course we'll address how good it actually is as a DPS build. Let's get into it. So the first build we're going to look at is focused on not using any helmet. I may as well break down the playstyle of his new kit. Of course you want to keep your 3 active, and throughout the runs that I did for the testing, I was cycling between pretty much all of my sentients to see if I can notice any significant difference in the gameplay. And I'll be honest, all 3 of the sentients are completely viable, especially for different levels of the mission. I think it's a complete playstyle choice as to which one you use the most. I personally do enjoy the Ortholist the most just because I enjoy seeing all those big damage numbers across the room occasionally, but all 3 are completely viable. Keeping that active to make sure you've got your shields up, and choosing areas to use your 4 on where enemies are necessarily funneling in the most, so that way they walk over that armor strip field. And then whichever group you are fighting, I'd recommend you use your 2 on them, so that way they all get debuffed and are basically one shot. This also makes sure any damage your sentients are doing will be way more. And then once you've done all of that and you're running out of energy, you would cast your 1 in a group of enemies, and you will be refunded pretty much all of the energy, and anything that survives will have Tau applied to them. That's the thing, because of this Tau damage from the 1 and applying it everywhere, especially if you're not using the Ortholist, you can spam the first ability a bit more on different groups of enemies to make sure they're primed for, you know, your second ability, your sentience, and your own weapons. Spreading Tau is a really good thing, and it's going to make sure you're doing more damage overall. And I love when Pablo does a rework like this, where he turns every ability into a viable option within the kit, so that way you don't need to make use of helmet if you don't want to, and Caliban now feels like a more complete experience as a Warframe. The 1 is now way better and fits seamlessly within his playstyle, and it's actually fun to use. And the next build we will be talking about is Nourish, which ironically the new version of his first ability has kind of replaced in most instances outside of the synergy we will talk about. And speaking of, let's cover the Nourish build. Nourish is of course the setup I was using in the old video before the rework, and it is still viable, but not necessarily in the same way. See, Caliban's new first ability, the energy gain you get back is way more efficient than the energy you get from Nourish. It's just more consistent and you can control when you get this energy back. However, now the viral damage that you gain from Nourish is way more important to Caliban's kit because it can be applied to his sentients, specifically the author lists, and it's also good on the conquer list. The viral damage working with his third is extremely potent. It's going to make you do way more damage, especially to groups that you've stripped and debuffed, and this turns his third ability into a way better DPS tool, albeit it's still inconsistent and I wouldn't rely on it, but it's a nice playstyle switch up, so you're not really priming enemies, let's say, with the tower damage from your 1 because you're now using Nourish, but you have got that big viral proc and doing viral damage with your weapons and your third. The old version of Caliban did feel super reliant on Nourish, and now that isn't the case. And if anything, you can be even more of a caster with your base first ability because the energy gain back is more than Nourish. But yes, this build and setup is still completely viable. And you also notice that across both builds, I am still using a large amount of shield regen mods. A lot of you won't find this necessary depending on the content you're going to, but for me, I like having those extra windows of time to be able to get my shield gain and regen back. Also, I think this update's a little bit bugged right now in a number of ways, including shield gating. On multiple occasions across loads of Warframes, Brief Respite is not working. Like, I am casting my abilities, and you can even see during stuff like Rolling Guard, I'm not getting my shield back, and it's getting me killed a lot, so just note that for right now. I'm pretty certain that Brief Respite is currently bugged, but hopefully once that gets sorted out, Caliban will be even more immortal, especially with a setup like this, because the shield regen will be so much faster. Because the way it works, as soon as you get shield back from your shield gate, the regen will start up again. Another build worth trying with or without Nourish is a maximum range build. This one forgoes some survivability, but going for max range allows you to create these huge fields of armor strip, and this is extremely fun to use and convenient because you're going to be spreading massive areas of rooms, and if you're in maybe an open world or a wide open area on another mission, it's overall going to be more effective for you and your team. This also affects the 1 and the 2. Being able to cast your 1 and hit as many enemies as possible due to that range is going to give you guaranteed energy back, so range definitely synergizes super well with this kit. Now, before we close out the video, we've got to quickly talk about my Archon shards, and of course I'll give you the build for the boar that I was using in the gameplay because I know some of you guys are going to want it. For my setup, I like running 3 Talforge blue shards. This is going to give me enough energy to spam my abilities as well as freeing up the build so I can fit in equilibrium, and of course those spare shield regen mods. So if you want to run these builds, you might have to invest in the shards, but for example in the Nourish build you could forego Streamline and use Prime Flow instead if you don't want to rock these shards. And if you've got a build that has over 200% power strength, then you won't need the Talforge red shard. That is purely there for a build where I'm only using Blind Rage, but I would 100% recommend the Talforged Amber because the casting speed is kind of necessary on Caliban. And as for the Boar Prime build, I'm running a bunch of viral damage. It's lacking fire rate, but this setup is focused around dealing enough damage in and out of Incarnate form, and it hits like an absolute truck, especially with Caliban. So yeah, that's going to do it for my coverage of the new Caliban setup. I'll leave you with a bit more of the gameplay from the almost 2-hour run I did. He can handle himself way more easily now, and I think the rework has made a hell of a lot of difference, and you should definitely try him. I appreciate you guys for watching the video. Check out the previous if you haven't. We went to level cap in a survival as a solo Koumei, and we'll have more videos up on this channel soon, so please feel free to sub. My links are in the description. I appreciate all the support. I'll see you guys next time. Take care.